I forgot what I wanted to title this video. I think it's something like our lack of freedom and the sometimes suckiness of life, or something like that. I don't know why I used to feel more comfortable making videos out here and not as much anymore. I mean, I don't think anybody's listening, but I guess they could be. This video is probably not going to be particularly uplifting, and I only have a general idea of what I want to talk about, but I guess I'm usually, seems like, inspired to make videos when I'm not in a good mood, which is interesting when you just think about how people perceive things in terms of, I don't know, it's like the limited information that we receive, right? So it's like, I might have all sorts of different perspectives on things, but if I'm gonna make YouTube videos, particularly when I'm in a not so good mood, then everything gets funneled from what you perceive of my ideas through that lens. It's just interesting how that works through everything, right? The different things that motivate people to say their opinions, to which way to express their opinions, all that stuff. There's just all these filters that can sometimes contribute to the sort of elusiveness of truth and how people really feel about things and people's motivations and all that kind of stuff. But I guess maybe we can get a little bit closer to truth when we pick up on certain patterns, like me trying to say, hey, like, maybe there's a biased thing happening here if I turn on the camera every time I'm particularly feeling a bit lost about something or depressed and all that. That being said, I don't think necessarily that being in a depressed mood makes sort of a philosophical perspective inherently less valid than being in a positive mood. We're always being influenced by something, right? So if really good things are happening and I was making a philosophical video, then I'm biased there because of all the lucky, or however you want to describe, the positive things happening and how that might influence my worldview, my advice, my observations, and so on. But I am going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, or at least in the past it was one of my favorites, until I realized, or felt that I realized, I guess I'm contradicting myself in the sense of making this video, that it was a sort of pointless thing to reflect on. And I'm referring to determinism, the idea that we don't have free will, because if it's true, it sort of becomes this useless idea, right? It would mean that, and this is where I like some of, there's this book called Debunking Determinism by David Lawrence. I don't even know if you can really get it very easily anymore. He's not someone who's well known by any means, but I found that book really compelling when he was kind of arguing against points made by Robert Sapolsky, Sam Harris, and so on. And while I don't know that necessarily he's 100% right, or that he completely debunked it, I think he made some really valid points that, at the very least, poked holes in the philosophy of determinism being something you can actually use in any way, because it ends up being sort of this contradicting thing that ultimately, if we're just robots and everything that I'm saying is just this robotic programming, then there's not even a way to determine who the rational robots are, right? You might think, well, no, I'm using the logical part of my brain to figure out that determinism is true and here's what we ought to do about it. Oh, wait, I don't have any control of any of that, and I'm going to obviously be biased to think that my way of thinking is logical, or else I would think differently just like everybody else thinks, and you can't even derive any sort of oughts from a reality where no one has control. And so those were some really compelling type of things that David Lawrence, which I kind of made some of those observations on my own, but in his book he really goes into more detail on those. So yeah, it's a self-defeating, it's the perspective that can be interesting, but generally people tend to find it a bit depressing, and also like I said, it becomes a bit useless. That all being said, I'm still gonna ramble about it anyway. After all, I have no choice, right? Always like that joke. I don't know who came up with it. For Christopher Hitchens, I know, is said, that comment about, I believe in free will. After all, I have no choice, or something to that effect, which I thought is pretty funny, and in a weird way, actually not just a joke, but might maybe pretty profound in some way. But yeah, I guess what has this on my mind is that whether we acknowledge it or not, I think we all really wish we could control. People talk about like, this person is controlling, or this person wants to control this or that. But I believe the reality is that we all wish that we could control everything. I mean, if you really are honest and think about, it might, if you admit this, then you might say, well, wow, you're admitting that you really want to be some tyrant or some evil dictator. But the reality is, even your desire to not control something is control, right? If you say, well, in this area, I really don't want to have a say. Well, you want to have control over not having a say in that area, right? You want to be able to choose to relinquish even the lack of control. So in reality, we all wish that we could control everything. And there's a problem with that, aside from just the obvious things that you would come up with, which is, if we live in a reality where we actually have zero control, then that would mean that if what I'm saying is accurate, which I know some of you might dispute it, but I believe it's accurate, at least in a sort of abstract sense, if you're thinking of it that way, and not, actually, I don't want to control this one thing. Anyway. But yeah, there's this fundamental problem to want the exact opposite of what reality is, which is a place where I think there's at least a solid chance that we don't really have control. So therein lies the problem. And then therein lies the problem of all the philosophies that might even account for that in some sense, or even loosely might account for that. Like with Buddhism or something, where maybe there might be some ideas about letting go and letting things be, and acceptance, and different ideas that have to do with not having this obsession of control. If you believe what I'm saying, then that would actually fundamentally be out of your hands just as much as anything else. And even if you took that to its furthest point, you'd say, well, you also have to let go of wanting to let go, and you have to want to let go of wanting to let go of wanting to let go. A lot of philosophy maybe is like that, where it's just the further you push it, it all kind of becomes a contradiction eventually, and it loops back around on itself. And I know there's probably some sort of Buddhist little explanation for that, right? That someone would have on why that's not that way. But I still think fundamentally it would kind of revert back to that, in the sense that even the desire to be desireless is its own desire. When people say, you'll never be happy if you chase happiness, if that's what you prioritize, it's just not something that's like, that's just another version of prioritizing happiness. Actually, it's all just semantics. It's like, don't focus so much on happiness. That the key to happiness is don't focus on happiness. If you actually break that down, it actually reverts back to happiness being the focal point. So, I do think there could be value in getting closer to some kind of acceptance, and I think what that looks like is not actually buying into sort of any of these cliches, and just actually acknowledging some sort of disappointment. Like, man, I'm disappointed that I don't feel like I can think differently about this, or feel differently, or whatever, as opposed to this other way of doing things, this pressure we put on ourselves. But even that, right? That philosophy I'm putting forth can be its own thing that could be, said to be a loop or contradiction. But yeah, I mean, because essentially what I'm saying is no matter what, you're striving for some sort of thing that is somewhat impossible, or if you break down the semantics thing happening, it's like, what are you actually saying at the end of the day? That being said, we can also say, well, maybe I'm wrong about some of these things, and what if I am wrong, and what if we do have a little bit more control and all this stuff, and if that were to be true, then yeah, I mean, I guess there's probably a value in still seeing, it's like there's the middle ground is sort of saying, man, there's so many things I can't control, things that people tend to agree on. I can't control the weather. I can't really control other people's behavior or certain elements of bad luck and so on. But I think I can control this thing. I think I can control. That is sort of the happy medium where you could adopt, in a way that feels genuine, a sort of Buddhist-like philosophy, right? Where you let go because you feel like you do have control of trying to let go of wanting to have control, or that you have control over the whole acceptance thing and all that. I don't know. Maybe it's all overthinking, but so yeah. There was somewhere else where I wanted to go with this, and I'm trying to remember about freedom and the suckiness of life. Yeah, I mean, just that sometimes no matter how much you try to convey an idea to someone, that you think is indisputable, or you're dealing with logic or this or that, like, it doesn't necessarily guarantee anything, and I've talked many times about, people's political, religious disagreements, all of those things. And at some point, right, it's like, well, okay, are we all even agreeing to try to play the logic game? Can we even agree what that looks like? Can we even play the logic game in our interpersonal relationships? Like, we try to play, we act like we can play the logic game when it comes to religion, politics, all these things, and you see people in their personal lives can't even hash it out. That's why there is some truth to, Jordan Peterson's whole thing when he was like, hey, stop trying to change the world, man, clean your own room. It's like, there is, it's not just this sort of like throwaway line. There is actually something deeper to that, which is like, you want world peace, but if you can't even have world peace with your mom and dad, or your girlfriend and boyfriend, or whoever, it's like, but and some people say, oh, that's too defeatist, just because you're can't figure out things in this area. Just because you have a messy room doesn't mean you can't fight capitalism, bro, or whatever the good fight happens to be that day. But I think there is something to that, right? It's like, if you see how difficult it is to even get the basics done, where like, if you're not easily having really fulfilling friendships, romantic relationships, or whatever, like the kind of basics that you would think a good life entails, it does seem a bit delusional in some way to want to solve like much bigger conflicts, right? Where there's where you clearly have much less of a say, much less of a control in it, and that's where some of it becomes, like more of a cosplay thing. It's all your personal psychology playing out. Like, and I've talked about this before, but yeah, it's just your political party, your religion, whatever tribal affiliation is. It's all just part of your own like psychological jerking off that makes you feel something, as opposed to there being some sort of one tangible difference you're making in these areas that people claim to be passionate about, bicker about, in different, on social media or wherever else, at the coffee shop. So anyway, this is probably a long tangent. Maybe all my videos are a long tangent, so I guess that's okay. But yeah, I guess the second part of the title, something about the sort of suckiness of life, is there's something to different ways people operate And part of this is in the framework of therapy, like mental health therapy, where it's almost like baked in this idea that life ought to not suck, and that you can always change it and do something about it and whatnot. And of course, we can always see that. We don't need to point out the obvious, the ways that people, it's like, yes, it does appear, at least on the surface, if you don't dive too deep into it, it seems obvious that everyone can make changes, right? Everyone can eat healthier, theoretically, and go on walks and all these things. But I think there is something that can actually be harmful to people about this sort of, these sort of assumed ideologies that almost everybody has, right? It's not, that's something that's like almost everyone seems to be in agreement on, regardless of where you are politically or whatever. It's just this thing that seems to be self-evident, which I guess what I'm referring to is sort of the free will thing, like you can just do this, you can just do that, or you can just, if you just communicate in this way, you'll be understood, and all these things. It can be, I think the determinism thing, the feeling like you can't change anything, of course, can lead to nihilistic despair. But unfortunately, the flip side can do the same thing, because sometimes it actually doesn't matter how hard you try to do this or that. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get whatever desired outcome you're going for. And that can go for almost anything. It doesn't just, just because you think you're trying hard. And it might be, in large part, not just because, some things are out of our control. It might be because everything might be. One thing just that, I'm probably going to wrap this up now, but, the thing that I've pointed out before when I've talked about free will and sort of evidence against free will is just some of the most obvious things, which really tend to be the most damning to the free will defenders. It's not going deep into sort of deep research and studies and science and really digging at all these studies that show this or that, or someone's 400-page book or anything like that. It's when you're talking, especially when you're not, because pausing can be its own sort of diversion from reality. Oh, because I'm pausing, that's a sign of free will. But let's talk about when you're talking without pausing. It's so obvious that there's no control, right? If there was, I wouldn't have misspoken earlier when I said Buddhist or something instead of Buddhist. I wouldn't have said some things I wish I had said with more clarity. I wouldn't have said maybe a couple lines that I wish I could take out of this video, maybe I could edit. When you say things off the cuff, then it's so obvious that, did you always contemplate every sentence? Did you always contemplate every sentence before you speak it, right? And that, it seems like if you're being honest, the answer is no. Clearly, you don't always contemplate sentences before you speak them, which means there has to be some degree of a lack of control in the things you say, right? And the argument against this would be, well, I can regain that control with the pausing. And that's always been the point of contention, that it's like, that if you dive into it, that doesn't necessarily prove anything. The pause in itself, when do you choose to pause or not to pause? Is that something that, are we sure that there's control over when pausing is happening versus not happening? Could I really, if I wanted to never speak without thinking for 5 minutes before each sentence, could I really totally choose to do that? Obviously it would be impractical, but I don't even know if it would actually be possible. If I was dedicated to spending the rest of my life not saying a sentence without really just sort of going over it again and again until I'm sure that that's what I want to say. Anyway, where does this all lead? I don't know. Just some thoughts. And yeah, just some thoughts.